You okay? You look so nervous.
Thanks. Where's Mark?
What's wrong with this guy?
Mark
I'm
is
back.
supposed to join. Maybe wait for 1 minute for Mark. He should. Ah, Mark, here. We're waiting for you. We are 3 minutes in.
For me or for everybody? Look at you. No, you're supposed to have yellow and green versus brown. Yeah. Like Brett. Yeah. He's right in fashion. Yeah, perfect. Pink. Perfect. That's Brooks Brothers you're thinking of. No, this is the way. You match your girlfriend. Should we go?
Yes, we have it.
So, nice to be here. Why you laugh? You think I'm lying? And I have to say, I guess this is an extended version of a discussion that has been going on for a long time. And as everyone else who has sat here has said, and I'll add to this, I used to think that the way to ensure that you succeeded in architecture, among other things, was to outwork everybody. And it's clear that, at least in the context of the production of this book, that Patrik has outworked damn near everybody. And I think accolades for that and for that effort. And I have to say, everybody okay? I'm worried about this guy. That the discussion or the effort to make the book, we have to touch on the second book also, but the effort to make the book has for sure galvanized a very substantial and important and essential and critical and necessary and fundamental discussion in, I think, the academy, and I don't mean in the academy in a constipated way, but a live, vital discussion which probably hasn't taken place in a hell of a long time. Maybe since Hitchcock and Johnson's book, which is, by the way, an interesting subject for Patrik. But I just have a couple of minutes, and so I wanted to mention a few points. I want to start out with a book called The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, which is written by a guy by the name of Murakami, who I think is a Japanese author who, among other accolades, won the Nobel Prize. But I think this gets to the essence of the problems or the inadequacies of Patrik's prescription for a new style. So this is what it says. This is just a small couple lines. We think it is only... We were just having a discussion about freedom. Am I doing that? Or are you looking? Patrik's doing it.
God, this is for God. Okay, wait, I switch this off.
Yeah.
Should we, why don't we, how can we avoid that?
Withdraw your book.
This is sabotage. Oh. But I want you to know that we did have a brief discussion about what's called the Penelope theory of architecture. And in the next book that Patrik produces, he'll deny everything which he insisted on in the first book, and then we know we're making some progress. As, for instance, in this example, we think it's only natural to get rice pudding after we put rice pudding mix in the microwave and the bell rings. But to me, that's just a presumption. I would be kind of relieved if every once in a while, after you put rice pudding mix in the microwave and it rang, and you opened the top, you got macaroni au gratin. And I think, without trying to be too elliptical about this discussion, I think that one of the points that we've disputed or contested has to do with what I would call the surprise content in architecture. And that means that work would produce not what is forecast or prescribed, but what's not anticipated. And I have a feeling that you don't get to it because somebody says, or you don't get to that, if you get to it at all, because you set out to be a novelty, a kind of conceptual novelty, or an oddity, or sign up in somebody's avant-garde team. I think those kinds of teams and those kinds of designations follow sometimes years after the substance of the avant-garde has disappeared. So the categories belong to people who make categories, who like labels and nomenclature and charts and lexicon. But it's not so clear that those charts and nomenclature and lexicon account for the content or new content in architecture. And I think I mentioned before during the discussion, I think the discomfort quotient, which I don't think you choose to be a part of when you open your eyes and you look out at the world and you see, and I don't know whether it was Bertrand Russell or Bernard Shaw, you know, the old line that the Kennedys used to quote, some people see things as they are and ask why, and I dream of things that never were and ask why not. And which is not a refrain, really. It's an instinct. It's an instinct of a kind of intrinsic dissatisfaction, and not only with the world outside you, but in many cases with the world within yourself. And I think that requires two qualities. I think Patrik has one. I think it requires an enormous self-confidence and conviction to hypothesize and to conceptualize and to implement. And at the same time, it requires the opposite quality. It requires an intrinsic skepticism of your optimism. And I think the only way to make it work is to run the two simultaneously. And it's not a technique. It's not, in a way, a choice. I mean, it may be in the end that I'm arguing what I am because somehow or other this is what I came to be. And Patrik, in a different way, is arguing for what he, not for what it is, but for what he is. He's arguing for what he is and trying to say it's what it is. So I think in some ways what we're both doing is trying to generalize. I'm a little more skeptical of this, to make generic what's idiosyncratic. And I think this is the foible of the book, that if it were idiosyncratic or if it were particular, this might make it plausible. But when it tries to generalize, and I look around the room and everybody is taking notes and not looking up, then it seems to me that when style becomes style, it loses its speculation, it loses its capacity to make a mistake, because after all, if you make a city, the roofs can't leak. They can't leak or you're finished. But if you're speculating, it's pretty likely the roof is going to leak. And the question is a leakable roof part of the context of parametric architecture? It's not. Yeah, go.
No, I was just checking time. So, no, we have another 17 minutes. Don't worry.
Oh, you want me to keep going, or you want to? No, I thought you wanted.
No, I can come in. I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I keep going.
No, it's interesting. You kind of my theory of you keep confirming, and in a sense, you are, kind of late 60s, early 70s radical. SIAC is a creation out of this revolutionary period because the modernist school of architecture was, couldn't continue. But I believe that you can't be a radical forever. Otherwise you have to start, overturning yourself continuously, and then you're going into some kind of circular motion and are left behind. That's the danger. And I think, although I agree of course, in the necessity of continuous innovation, the element of surprise, the element of freewheeling browsing, even in every single project to a certain extent, but 95% is reproduction in the cumulative period. And I think if you look at the evolution, which is the powerful paradigm through which to think social evolution and societal evolution, but also you can think each subsystem goes through an evolution which is a co-evolution of independent, mutually observant and mutually adapting subsystems without control center. That's this kind of polycontextual image of society which Luhmann gives, but each of these subsystems evolving in adaptation to an overall process. The co-evolution and the evolution has three mechanisms. It has mutation, selection, reproduction. Evolution doesn't work on mutation. And I think it's important that in terms of the discipline, the way it's been set up, it has, as Luhmann would say, differentiated mechanisms of evolution separately. So the mutation aspect is located within the avant-garde. The mutation aspect is also located in this kind of potential of the medium to produce unconstrained, nearly random, meaningless stuff on paper, on the digital world. But then selection takes place, and selection, I would believe that the mechanism of selection is architectural theory. At a certain point, there are those mutators who just kind of create stuff, and then there is a kind of discourse about them. There's a theoretical challenge, investigation, querying, validation, further instruction. I think that theory does mostly, although there are aspects of theory which I think are partly mutational as well, in terms of injecting a new language. Let's say the conceptualist, formalist like Jeff is less a kind of selective theorist, but a kind of productive, generative theorist. And I have a theory of architectural theory with three sub types.
Do me a small favor, because we get so buried in the kind of formulaic jargon. I would just try to talk about this in a kind of straight way. I would warn all of you, and particularly students, in a political discussion, as opposed to dealing with the substance of issue like revolution. So Patrik started out and he said, "Hey, Moss, you're just a 70s revolutionary guy. And since we all know that the latest, the hippest, the coolest, and the newest, and the most novel is where we all belong, you're ipso facto out of the discussion." So this is I don't know that I want to respond to that except to refer to him as a 19th century progressive in the mode of Darwin and so on. I'm not sure any of that kind of debate. I think I could make the case actually pretty easily, but I think what we're talking about, if we're talking about change and we're talking about an internal condition, and he refers to it as a fashion which is out of date. So if Ezra Pound turned it over, or T.S. Eliot turned it over, or any other poet, or Goya, or someone, this is a human instinct. It's a durable instinct. Patrik belongs to the school that, guess what? Everything is moving. Everything is moving fast. Everything is moving faster and faster. And you know what that means? It means progress. Progress, yeah? Better and better. So this is probably very easy to destroy. Some things actually don't move much. Some things move a lot. Some things probably should move differently than they do. And simply to applaud a kind of very conventional Nokia phone sales pro forma for progress actually does a disservice to a critical intellectual view of a different point of view. So I would say the idea of castigating the opposition by saying it's old news also castigates the present, because new news is not necessarily the news either. And both of them require a kind of very precise intellectual analysis, so it turns out it's a much messier question.
But let me ask you a question. I mean, I do accept that you have a multiplicity, obviously, of characters. There's a division of labor in the discipline between the formalists, the pragmatists, the analysts, the problematizers, the kind of mutants, and so on. I accept that. And none of these figures can be generalized. That's why, and that's why I take a step out and I look at the total, how should I say, set of diverse species and try to understand what their contribution is. And it seems to me that your refusal to, I feel kind of misunderstood and also kind of categorized in a way I also want to reject, because I do believe that I'm not into prescription. I'm first of all into description and describing what has been taking place. I'm reflecting on the last 12 years, what has been happening. And out of this, and I do recognize progress. I do see my commitments, and I stand with these commitments. I'm just reflecting and describing myself and say, have I been doing something meaningful? Is that progressing? Why am I at the same kind of concept with the same kind of ambitions, agendas, and values, working away for 12 years? And I want to ask you back the question, why are you afraid to categorize? Are you afraid to commit? You have nothing to commit to except the kind of refusal to commit?
No. I think what I'm saying is that your categories don't admit oppositions. That's why I read about macaroni. You'll never get macaroni out of rice pudding. You'll get 6 flavors of rice pudding. And the possibility, especially now, so you're a global guy, I'm a local guy, and when you look at a global context and you see very many vantage points or very many perspectives, so it seems to me you have to build into the system the tension between possibilities, which would at least from time to time suggest that you left something out, that something fundamental is missing, and all the systems.
That's what I'm hoping for.
Hang on, because this is why we had a discussion, and we were talking about pluralism, and pluralism as a cynic, as opposed to pluralism as an advocacy. And pluralism, the cynic says, is there not because it's good, but because it allows very vigorous contention and opposition, whereas you say, in a very large office, you can't admit sending Team 29 down a different road than Team 27, otherwise who knows? But there's another possibility, you know, you send Magellan east and you send Columbus west and you think you're in India and you find America. And this is also the way things are discovered. So I think this is an important point of view to countenance the fact. And look, you mentioned Darwin, and you mentioned Newton, and you mentioned Marx, 19th century, 6th century guys. I don't know whether that makes you an antique or not, but we know something they didn't know, I think, in a very fundamental way. Newton doesn't know anything about electromagnetism. Darwin doesn't know anything about catastrophism. So I think when you look at Freud, doesn't know anything about Prozac, you know. So in a very fundamental way, when you look over a long period of time at many theories that are useful, that are intelligent, that are helpful, and nobody is opposed to that. But the skepticism quotient actually nudges it in a different way. It says, okay, fuck you. And then you have to, and you have to reconcile.
The skeptic taking risks.
I think, I just want to ask you a question, because it seems like there's two different things. Okay. One is a claim by Patrik that a critical project that saw itself as producing an architecture which was neither consumable or commodifiably prototypical for all sorts of reasons, that it was critical, and in order to be critical, it had to not be so easily consumed. That as an avant-garde project is finished, okay? And that your argument is there are other avant-garde projects that are not worrying about the degree to which they're consumable, and in fact, they may find better efficacy in the degree to which they are consumed. So it's a specific problem, but does that mean the people that we should, stop teaching that? Or, I mean, I understand, I think everybody would agree that the thrust of the critical project in its most avant-garde moment has now become institutionalized to an extent, and is part of contemporary practice. As a small landscape. That was its achievement. You know, that's all it ever wanted to achieve. That was an important achievement, and it actually had a significant effect in the discipline. But I can't.
But wait a second. In the first place, I don't know that anybody, at least speaking for myself, am particularly interested in the categorization of the avant-garde, which is assigned by Domus or somebody at a certain point, when there's enough discussion of that. I don't think it really has to do with what category I'm in or you're in. I think it has to do with a way of critical thinking about the world that you live in, how you respond to it, and how you choose to define it or redefine it. It's surely not the conclusion that the dissatisfaction with modern architecture, I think in some ways Patrik's argument disowns a lot of the critical issues in modern architecture, one of which was sweep the street clean, get rid of it. It's a kind of essentially I hate history argument, whether it was in practice that or not. So the dissatisfaction quotient, as opposed to let's go, there was a dissatisfaction in modernism with the system of capital and the awarding of projects and the way that was done. That's replaced with an accommodation to that. So in many ways, the contemporary argument is an accommodation to a lot of the enemies that were enemies that engendered the modern argument, which is one of the reasons I say you have to have enemies. Contemporary architecture has no enemies. It needs enemies, but it can't artificially develop enemies. They have to belong to a point of view, to a perspective, to an argument that you need to make in the face of the establishment of something. And I think when you call it a style, and I think I said this before, when you make a style, you make something memorizable, teachable, learnable, testable, producible. So now what you're doing is you're enforcing, or you're implementing a lexicon, a way of thinking, all of that. I wasn't comfortable with it in the 70s. I'm not comfortable with it now. There's no difference with that. And I think other people of different ages and different points of view will feel similarly. This is not the idea, I think, ideally speaking, of teaching, which is, I think, not Patrik's idea, is don't do what I teach you. Tell me why what I'm teaching you is inadequate. I'm not here to teach you so you can come and work for me. I'm here to teach you so you can rethink what I thought. It's a very different idea of what it means to teach.
But how much, let's say, elaborate intelligence and sophistication can you build up with this pattern? I mean, I think it's a little bit false, in fact, the posture to assume that somebody who's stepping in into my studio at the DRL, who's maybe 23-year-olds with a bit of experience in, I don't know, in Europe, India, China, would be on par, and that I would expect an enormous learning curve from such a person.
You won't have to worry about it.
That's PC nonsense.
You don't have to worry about it, in fact, because almost everybody will do what you're asking. They'll do it. Because the exception is the exception because it's the exception. If the exception is the rule,
the exception will always succeed.
With
a challenge with a.
Well, a couple of days ago, sitting in what is it called, Tsinghua University, which you know, in Beijing, and there was, of course, I won't mention any names, but of course, a primary advocate, acolyte of parametrics. Holy shit, wherever you go. You know, a great guy, interesting guy, intelligent guy, a lot of energy, so on and so on and so on. So it's contagious, there's no question. So I just want to assure Patrik there's no need to be nervous because he has the numbers, but doesn't necessarily mean he has the substance.
Well, don't be so. I think that the numbers most probably are attracted by some substance.
He was. He was.
But doesn't think, Eric, that there's a passion and enthusiasm for the potential to actually begin to affect people's lives the way architecture always wished it would, at a scale it always imagined it could?
But then, for sure. And I'm absolutely a supporter of that and an advocate of that. There isn't any reason not to take advantage of that opportunity, exploit that opportunity, and develop a mechanism which accommodates that opportunity. I think the difference is that the mechanism that accommodates that opportunity has its strengths, and because it has the strengths that it has, and they're clear, it also has liabilities, and they're also clear. So let's talk about the strength, if it can do what you said. So this is great. But what is it not doing? What is it omitting? What is it leaving out? What is it forgetting about? So this is also a discussion. So in a serious, critical, intellectual venue, those should be talked about. That's all. Not he should retire to the Bahamas.
You have to. If I'm a man of, I'm a doer. I'm not actually somebody who's just wanking theory. For me, that is it's an action program, and the person I adore and love most in the world is Lenin. And he had to write 40 volumes, and then
now you're in trouble.
To transform Russia into the Soviet Union. But the point is this: you got to make decisions. If you do a project, you can't hold all your options in critical suspense. You gotta make a selection.
But Patrik, you're not the only person in the room that does projects, and everybody doesn't do projects in the same way.
Can I just intervene about kind of the nature of pedagogy? But before I do, there was one point I just wanted to clear up about Freud. You said Freud didn't know about Prozac. Freud certainly knew about Prozac in general, in the following sense.
Let's say Freud didn't agree with Jung. How's that? Freud didn't agree with Adler. How's that?
Seems a rather different point. But I mean,
no, it's not. It's absolutely the same point, which is that there are 3 or 4 very fundamental, in some ways overlapping, and in some ways clearly different ways of understanding the human psyche. If you sign up for Oedipus and Electra, you've left out something very fundamental. That was the point.
That's not the point.
That was my point.
No, well, the point would be this. When I say that Freud knew about Prozac, what I mean by it is that actually, in a sense, he knows more about Prozac than we do, because we think we know about Prozac, but we don't. The point being is that Freud's general position was that most people's lives were so miserable that they could only get through it with very strong doses of intoxication. He himself kind of helped to kind of develop the use of cocaine, etc. I mean, basically, Freud's point was that they wouldn't be able to kind of survive without it because reality was simply too painful. In that sense, the drug is simply another kind of intoxication. Prozac is. I mean, that it's not counted that way because you get it from a chemist rather than a bar, really doesn't make any difference. Yeah, I was afraid of that. That's one point. But when it comes onto the question of pedagogy, I mean, it seems to me you both take a sort of like the wrong position. You make the kind of Lionel Trilling point that, if you're going to be a teacher, isn't it wonderful when when you teach so well that your students disagree with you? I've always found that to be, a particularly kind of dishonest form of liberal kind of humanism.
I didn't say it was pleasant at all.
Well,
it's very
or
uncomfortable.
unpleasant.
That's your interpretation. But
how challenging they are. If you hear people kind of at the AA, I mean, for teachers, there's almost a tyrannical form in which they endlessly congratulate the 2 students on being, little geniuses. And it can get to be quite a wearing kind of thing to listen to. And actually, I don't think it's terribly helpful for the students. So in a sense, and there are certain forms, and it's worth paying attention to them, that act a good deal more like how Patrick's describing something. But it seems to me there's a big question that he doesn't address. If we were talking about learning a musical instrument, right? When a teacher has played something, let's say, technically very well, and the teacher and the student fumbles and gets it wrong, the teacher's not doing very well if the teacher says, well, that's your way of playing it. I guess that's really interesting too. They're there to teach the violin or whatever it is.
Playing the trumpet in the Latin Quarter in New Orleans, it depends.
Yes, it does.
I mean, because when you cartoon these things out of existence, you trivialize the point. That's not the point.
My point to Patrick, in a sense, is then, okay, you've got the piano teacher sometimes on your side, but what is the difference between what you might call training and pedagogy? What's the difference, or is there a difference? Because it seems to me, Patrick's response to you, I mean, you're holding up a view of education, even though I don't like the terms in which you framed it. He's holding up the context, essentially, of the collapse of pedagogy into training.
Actually,
and
I'm holding up a concept of practice. That's the way I run my office. I mean, it's not 400 people, it's 28 people, but that's the way we run it. So it's not only a pedagogical argument, it's a studio argument. They're both.
Well, my point of view here gives me a good kind of hook to come onto something which I was already suspecting to be discussing with Mark, but it fits here that I believe that we have to distinguish the education system from the autopoietic system of architecture / design, and I believe that I'm personally not in the education business. I don't see myself as a teacher, and I don't think that all schools of architecture really truthfully locating themselves in their evaluation criteria and criteria of success within the education system. I think places like the AA function totally different. You're thrown in from year one into a unit system which has ambitions with respect to participating in the contemporary avant-garde. And that's the way also I'm using students. They become collaborators in an avant-garde experiment. And the usual criteria of the education systems, formally, yes, we have to adhere to them. But the AA managed to kind of align external examiners and validating bodies and all sorts of education system rules and institutional ways of engagement, and their values precisely would be a kind of pedagogy. I don't think really happening here, and therefore I believe that some schools use the education system and its resources as a vehicle for design research, and it's not really, and I think that that's where I want to put it.
I don't know, I think we might be getting lost again. I think you said something, I'm not sure this is quite what you said, but if you didn't, you should have. Or I would, if you said it, I would agree with it.
It's not about growing personalities here. Yeah.
Arguably, architecture isn't teachable. You might be able to teach around it. And I think the best argument, I'm not sure the idea of teaching and the separation between teaching and practice is the kind of argument that I would make. I don't think I've ever thought of myself as a teacher either. I think I'm just someone who thinks in a certain way about problems and what they are and how they might be defined and how we could go forward, backward, or sideways in trying to find a solution. I think the issue would be in working or teaching, not so much to say you have to be novel, which I think was a word you used, but that you have to create an environment where the possibility of an intellectual alternative is supported and sustained, but not in a childish way, not in an adolescent way, not to trivialize what has been done so I can walk down the halls on my hands because everybody walked on their feet, therefore I'm novel. I think this kind of cartooning it diminishes the meaning, but the right to think in a way, you were talking about the mechanism here, which we all know, with studios where the idea is to become somehow part of the avant-garde. Almost no one does that. As I think you were saying, almost no one does that. So there's plenty of room for people to replicate, learn, have allegiances. This is not a problem. The problem is to see if you can find the exception and not insist that the rule is the exception. So I think you're doing something quite interesting. You're saying you're the avant-garde, and that's the rule. And not only is it the rule, but it's the contemporary way to do things. And when you put it in the way that you put it, it seems to me you're leaving out space for somebody to say, wait a minute.
I think the avant-garde initially is just a certain subsystem of the Autopoiesis of Architecture. I mean, there's a certain segment which has multiple strands, multiple competing directions. In the school, you have that. You have units with totally different agendas, different priorities, different criteria, different language. And so that's one, the avant-garde, where I don't emphasize the. But at the same time, I do believe that that these competing strands, they're not equally flourishing and proliferating. Some pick up more and more, and there's a kind of convergence, and then it becomes
no, I think
the avant-garde.
I think that's true.
The best contender for a hegemonic avant-garde style with the potential of going mainstream.
Well,
but when you look at Philip's book, which you mentioned in your book, Hitchcock and Johnson, and to me, as I understand it, and I spent some time just talking a little bit to him about this. What he did with Hitchcock was to kill the exploratory content, which was very diverse. The style guys, the futurist guys, the Ginsberg in Moscow, all of these people jettisoned the social and political component of contemporary architecture at that time, dropped it in the Atlantic Ocean, brought it to the Museum of Modern Art and said, okay, open up my book and for Kipnis, look at the index. This is how you do a contemporary building. Look at the index of that book. Look at it. Roof line, pilotis, ribbon windows, graphics. You want to be, hey kid, you want to be a radical architect? Do this and this and this and this. And that became the international style. And I think my argument is only once you codify it, once you methodize it, once you systematize it, it's over.
I want to come in on this point, sorry, Jeff, because it's an interesting point. The modernism, let's say, you have these transitional periods between the breakdown of classicism, historicism, and the emergence of modernism. You have this, what later was called the pre-modern. You have the expressionism. You have Art Nouveau. You have neo-neoclassicism. You have kind of outrageous figures like Finsterlin. You have Plechnik, but once in the early 20s, this kind of coalesces, converges, and gets the forward trajectory. And the style, it comes earlier. And also the separation from art happens in the Bauhaus, where at first you had Itten and Kandinsky, and these people were systematically eliminated out of the curriculum. And finally, in the mid-20s, when Hannes Meyer takes over, it becomes the industrial design and architecture school with a purpose. And these people were marginalized. But I think Theo van Dersberg is another kind of powerful figure in this respect. And it's
is that good or bad?
It's about 1924. I want to quote that. A close cooperation we have examined. In close cooperation we have examined architecture as a plastic unity made up of industry and technology, and have established that a new style has emerged as a result. We have examined the laws of space and their endless variations through spatial contrast, spatial dissonances, spatial supplementations, and have established that all these variations can be welded together into balanced unity. We have examined the mutual relationships, blah, 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 and he's introducing the concept of space and has a program of implementation. And that's doers, that's people with a purpose in life.
Oh, come on.
Hang on. I want to go back to the leaky roof problem. Because I think, Patrik, your argument, see if I'm correct in interpreting this way, and I think it was an incredible...
Sorry. A new age is dawning, the age of construction. That was the last sentence.
A new age is starting, the age of construction. I think your invocation, and I noticed the same thing as Eric, of the international style, has two parts. One is there was a style. It did consolidate out of a bunch of avant-garde practices, and it was able to solve problems in a foreseeable future. Actually lasted quite a long time. It started to decline, as you also described, for a number of reasons, including the emergence of a new problematic and also a kind of hegemony, the problem of stylistic hegemony. And then your argument is that the parametric tool is sufficiently agile that it can solve and address the most robust possible effects we could want to address in the foreseeable future. Plus it has the agility to allow a kind of freedom and invention.
Exactly.
Okay, and so that's what I think is the argument behind style and behind parametricism. But the characterization of the leaky roof is not, oh, I like roofs that leak. It's, I would like to join two materials that don't go together, because it produces a sense of a different musical, slightly difference between Tom Waits and, Placido Dominica. Yeah? There's a certain roughness and desire that will satisfy a few people's existential being that they would not be satisfied. Now, my problem with the parametric style is even if you have the power to put the leak in, you're inclined constantly to correct the problems. Even though the tool allows you the capacity to put the problems in or leave the problems in. Its very agility and the pressures you have to solve all those problems will domesticate it much faster than even modernism was domesticated. So that's what I'm starting to get clear now. The style, I think you're right on style. I think you're right on parametrics. I think you're wrong about the relationship between architecture and an existential fabric. You know, if we just make everything better, then it becomes a really horrible world to live in.
We make everything better, and everybody will go off into the sunset holding hands and kiss goodnight.
I would like to quote to you the first speech by the mayor of East Berlin when he promised, now that the wall was built, everybody in East Berlin and East Germany would have an above-average income.
Chicken in every pot.
So,
Well, I mean, thanks. I mean, so this was just a quote from 1923 or so.
Is it your enthusiasm based on the agility of the instrument?
Absolutely. I mean, you said it earlier. I mean, the new precise. Why did modernism go into crisis? Because it didn't have the versatility, it doesn't cover the variation, the complexity, the dynamism, and what you call the agility of responding. And I think now we're having, and that's precisely on these counts.
Maybe.
This new style is superior, and it has enormous amount. It is a new set of degrees of freedom. Each project has a new brief, oftentimes institutional innovations, unforeseen mixes of audiences. So it's a challenge, and that's why I think.
Look.
And you need guidance. You need structure to cope with these. So it's an exciting, innovative, and each project has more original innovation capacity and expectation than in every other prior style. And the last point I want to make, that if there is systematic internal bifurcations, even like what I call the subsidiary styles, under these principles, like in modernism you moved from the white modernism to brutalism, you had Sharoon, you had metabolism, you had the high-tech. These are all elaborations, new trajectories, variations, but they're all, once you look at it, you can analyze under the very, very systematic set of principles, which are all based on separation, specialization, repetition.
Look, I think this is not a debate about energy, dynamism, conviction, practice, it really in the end is a debate about the content of architecture and how to make architecture. And it was just, wait, you're coming in 2 seconds. And I think what you call variability, and I think when your colleague was speaking, what you call variability, and this requires a stretch of the lexicon, I think is very predictable variability, because it comes in a lexicon which, if it's not yet seen, it's anticipatable in the language of a certain kind of architecture, which makes it more style and less an interrogatory. And I would just argue for a little bit of the interrogatory and a little bit less of what you call variability. I still think is in, and you know how you know? You know when you put it up on the wall and there are 500 people looking there, and we both know what it means to put something on a wall, and everybody looks around and says, you want to do what? You want to do that? Wait a minute. And then you look at it, and what you think is something which moves the discussion and pushes the discussion, and it's foreseeable by everyone who's looking at it. Maybe. And if that's true, it's left something out.
Listen, I don't deny that. You have a right to exist. Okay, I'm not disputing that.
That's very generous of you, actually. And I think that statement in a way says a hell of a lot about you were talking about personalities, and actually says a hell of a lot about the premise that this is really sitting on. That's why you're turning red now. No. Rightly so. Now we got down to what it's really about. It's right, psychiatry.
Right, so no, but you have to understand, if you are let's say on a smart geometry conference, right, where there's a series of experts, which a selective group you need to share something to build on. Yes, you wouldn't have no right of existence there. Your kind of interceptions would, after the third time, become a nuisance. So, and that.
Well, they still invite me, so somebody must have changed their mind. No. You're just not the one issuing the invitations, but fortunately, there's others are.
Eric, don't take it personal, please. But you must recognize that there must be, you need to kind of be able to cumulatively build, and that means you need to make choices. And I'm not saying they're contingent choices, but if you refuse to make a choice, if you are the productive irritant, you are the kind of the guy who is undercutting and critiquing and making the fundamental. I think.
Yeah, but we're building.
It's very
this
important.
Is a straw argument. This is not true.
No, of course you're building, but.
We're going to.
Thank you very much.
I feel misunderstood.
Do you think
He needs oxygen.
God.
the international style was an impoverishment and we should be cautious not to repeat it? You said that there were all these wonderful experimental
I think
meetings.
in some ways Patrick is right. That it's a moment and you can't freeze the moment. And I think you're retrograde if you try. And I'm not trying to freeze the moment. But I'm interested in the instinct rather than the method. And you're more interested in the method and less interested in the instinct.
Well, I've come to, of course, I'm interested in method, but only as a aim to something else. I'm interested in impact, results, that my energies and intelligence is not wasted, and I know I need to have to make choices, and I want to,
You're not. You're making plenty of choices. You're doing just fine.
That's well,
Patrick, are you
I think Wolf is on.